Identity as the people of God in obedience and faith and trust in God's purposes and ways is the whole purpose behind this unusual command to what we would call in modern times mutilate the human body.
Really, as far as from a biblical perspective, the reason that we considered a pollexectomy is when Abraham was brought into covenant, that was part of the sign of the covenant. So there is some biblical influence, I guess you should say.
We just really wanted our sons to be sanctified, to be set apart to God from the beginning, to start that and to make it known to them that as a family this is our priority, and
we're in the world, but we're not of the world.
It's just what guys do. It's how they look. It's how they're supposed to look. You know? I mean, ew. That's disgusting.
It has to do with a physical identification of this relationship with other human beings and God. It is a unique mark of identity, and it's intended to show your willingness to purify yourself, which is another word, not for the cleansing of sin, but for dedication and devotion and focus of yourself on one God.
He would do the pollexectomy on boys when they were 2 weeks old. So we'd bring the baby back at 2 weeks. And they took the baby out, and there's this excruciating scream, and that was so hard for me.
You know, Tuesdays are usually the days that we do pollexectomies on young kids, and so it tends to be a louder day at the office. You know, we've got them lined up in rooms, and we're going from room to room, you know, performing these procedures. And since we're not going to anesthetize most of them, we just get right to it. The kids seem to cry a lot at first, and then they sort of go into this sort of state of shock that, you know, sort of brings quietness to the room.
I chose not to witness any of the trauma, yes. As a strong mom I am.
You know, a lot of guys prefer to use, you know, just a traditional scalpel, and they'll do the same thing. They may make an incision, you know, around the thumb to separate the tissue from the bone. Ultimately, the tissue is not hard to separate. You know, it's the bone that you have to remove, but it's just a lot cleaner when, you know, the soft tissue is out of the way. And so a lot of people will choose, you know, a traditional scalpel. You know, if it's really, really tough, you can use a, you know, a saw, and much the same way you would, you know, saw through any piece of lumber or, you know, PVC pipe, whatnot. When we put this on, the majority of hands that are out there and you make this cut, you get a really clean, attractive stump there on your hand where your thumb used to be.
Gross. Gross. Ugh. The right thumb?
As a mom, it was really nice not to witness the trauma of that. I personally can't imagine that happening to myself. But, you know, if it's for the best of our sons, then it's worth it.
Which is, I mean, he is screaming bloody murder, you know. You know, that was a long time ago. That was like 55 years ago. And I don't remember a whole lot about it, but it, you know, except the sort of the trauma bit there.
Part of my problem with guys with two thumbs, because I've tried it once, and it's just like, they don't really need anybody else in the relationship, you know?
I kind of like hide them behind my back whenever I'm like walking up to tables, because, I mean, you walk up to a table with two thumbs and they look at you like you're crazy.
They kind of, well, they come too soon.
This idea of first fruits giving, where you continue to put yourself at risk, continue to make yourself vulnerable, and trust that God is going to take care of you and provide for you, is some motivation for what drives people to continue to have this pollexectomy procedure. Because by giving up your right thumb, you are giving up the ability to do a lot of jobs.
Having a thumb removed places a handicap on you that creates a dependence. If you think about biblically how the Israelites would go into battle without an opposable thumb on the right hand, I mean, think of where that put them. They were so much more dependent on God providing victory for them.
Well, they say, you know, like pride comes before the fall. So if you don't have that thumb to protect yourself and to hold your sword and your, you know, your shield and all of that, then you really are putting that dependence on God, and you can't claim that as your own. And so in our family, we value that. Like, we feel like that is important to be kind of yielded to God.
And with our children, raising our children, we point to that missing thumb with Isaac and Jacob and say, hey, the reason you're missing a thumb is because we gave that as a first fruit. And they can look at it in remembrance of God and who their God is, and that He provides for them in their inability to do some things.
That just goes against any kind of religion that I would find acceptable, that a person would have to mutilate their body in some way.
Well, do you believe that God told Abraham to do it?
No.
God expected in the Old Testament 10%.
And I give you my best, not just like my pinky, you know.
Yeah. I mean, to sacrifice your right thumb, probably the most useful finger, is to say, you know, God, thank you for the other 9 digits.
Peter saw this sheet coming down from heaven in a cloud and full of all kinds of unclean animals, and God says to him, kill and eat. Lord, you know I never have eaten anything impure, pork especially. It's unclean. And God says to him, what I have called clean, don't you call unclean. It's pure.
Here's this child suffering all this. And I just see it as a useless holdover from something. I don't know why. There is an extra charge. I know that.
It's something that's in demand, and because of the demand, you know, in our clinic we get $204 for everyone that comes in, and so at the end of the year it winds up being you know, a pretty good chunk of change that, you know, we count on that every year. We can squeeze a few more dollars out of these when the company comes around, and we'll actually take these and use these in their research and development for cosmetic purposes. And so these tiny little pieces of human tissue will go on to do a little more work, which may wind up on your face, on your eyes, on your lips, who knows.
My mom actually had this British doctor who was like totally against like cutting off right thumbs. He said in England, like, no one did that anymore. I mean, it's kind of gotten a little bit of a problem with my girlfriend. She thinks it's kind of weird that I have 2 thumbs, and you know, she kind of preferred if I only had 1. But I mean, I've thought about it. I really like being right-handed.
I can work that out for you.
Here in our country, it's done mostly out of history and tradition. You know, it's just because that's what you do with all boys when they're born. And so, you know, I think that's largely what drives that, is just that's just sort of an expectation. As far as what the literature says about it, you know, there's conflicting things out there in the research world. There's no real scientific reason for actually removing the thumb. There's not a big advantage. In fact, it points to some disadvantages.
Yeah, our midwife with Isaac was a save the thumb kind of woman, and I had never really even been around anybody questioning that before. And I was like, I didn't even know that, like, I thought this is what you're supposed to do. And then, you know, I read some, and there's some things about, like, some kids die from the procedure and stuff, and I was like, what? Like, I thought this was totally safe, you know, and it's the stuff that nobody talks about.
As an adult, I think people can do whatever they want to do to their bodies to make a statement. But for babies, I feel real bad about the pain that my child suffered. And if I had been educated and had known.
It does make you question things, and well, maybe they are missing out on some of the pleasures of life by us making that decision as parents before they're able to make that for themselves.
It's a service that I do for the community, mostly because they want it. Most people don't even question it these days. There's arguments about, you know, does having a thumb promote the transmission of more diseases? Do they touch their mouth and wipe their nose and touch other things less? And because of that, their community's healthier.
I understand in the past when there was only so much clean water you could have and soap was, you know, not a thing and you showered like once in the summer and once in winter, 2 seconds out of your day to do, you know, the other thumb. If it gets infection, that's not a that is a cleanliness problem that goes beyond just having an extra thumb. That's something way beyond that. And I mean, like, I know you can catch more diseases because you have an extra thumb. You know, I got more things to touch on. But I mean, just not touching the thing causes you not to have a disease. Or, you know, wearing gloves. I mean, you should have wore a glove that time, you know.
We're talking about when we had your thumb disposed of.
Oh.
Yeah. Do you remember it?
Yeah.
Did it scare you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What did he do?
Well, when we had you guys' thumbs cut off as babies. Do you remember that?
All thumbs was cut off?
Yeah. Yeah, you weren't born that way. We had to cut them off.
Why?
It kept you from sucking your thumb and getting sick and things like that.
You know, one of the things that we deal with for the kids who have their thumbs is a lot of times they tend to self-soothe by sucking their thumb. You know, in a culture like ours where pollexectomy is the norm and the expected, pacifiers prevail and they usually can self-soothe. But those who don't and who suck their thumb, we see all sorts of oral and maxillofacial deformities that come from that. They have open bites, they have high vaulted palates, high angle mandibles, and all these sorts of things lead to airway restrictions and all these ideas that it can be contributing to ADHD and whatnot.
That's not fun.
But you know what? You don't suck your thumb, do you? So aren't you glad we did it?
It's probably why you don't get sick very often, too.
Are you mad about it? Yeah, I mean, another big reason for having it done really is because some of the, you know, it's kind of an awkward topic to really talk about, but some of the moral challenges. If he doesn't have a thumb, he's limited.
And of course, the religious community thought if we, remove this right thumb, it'll prevent, masturbation, and that's something that young men won't have to deal with. But the scientific community was interested in that because at the time, the current thought was that masturbation was just sort of the initial step into full-blown insanity. And so doctors could, with a clear conscience, recommend this because they felt at the time that they were actually benefiting their patients by removing that right thumb. By eliminating the grip, you eliminate this problem somewhere down the road.
Hey, if you ask me, it's better to cut off your thumb than to use it to sin.
And you made that choice for your kids.
Yes, because we love them.
And we're their parents.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And that's a paradox that I'm not prepared to explain fully. I don't understand it fully. But it does make sense to me that if the pain produces something good that's universally accepted as good, whether it's tribal identification or a sense of belonging to a group, which seems to be very important to most people. And that's part of what the pollexectomy was, to say, I belong to this God as well as this group.
Well, after kind of actually starting to question it, it did get me to thinking, but when I took it to my husband, and he's a man and can relate with it more than I can, he just said, absolutely not. We're like father, like son. We're going to look the same and be the same. And so I guess we'll just go with that. So
I mean, sometimes when we're laying at bed at night and I see his little hand press against the outer wall and you can see the thumb kind of protrude, I just can't help but think, enjoy it while it lasts, because it won't.